We are back, and with more ROM hack, and almost 3 years later like I promised in the last video. In my last ROM hack video, that's right, this is a series now, which means it's going to be 3 years until the next one. I mentioned War of the Gods. You know me, I always keep my promises. Anyway, I've played a couple more I'd like to recommend. Let's get into it. As always, links to every project are in the description. I've ended up with 2 separate mods for the same game, so instead of breaking them both down separately, I've decided to highlight each and then flat out state which I enjoy more. For Breath of Fire 3, we have Path of the Goddess versus Everything is Buff V2. Tell me the name doesn't give away the answer. You can't. I started with Everything is Buff as it seemed closest to vanilla, and I'm very protective of Breath of Fire 3. Every change I've ever seen was a downstep, and making every stat 10 times higher is no exception. I won't piss on anyone's boots and tell them they're clean. Everything is Buff sucks. Progression is trivialized and borderline worthless as it seems everyone's been supercharged, but to no real effect outside of chaotic unpredictability. You want a certain level of unpredictability when you take a base and make small changes to it. That's the point, but this is excessive. Breath of Fire 3 isn't perfect, and I'd certainly invite novel quality, but this isn't that. Plenty of changes are flat out meaningless. If I can beat an enemy in 5 strikes, each doing 30 damage, what functional difference does it make to give him 10 times the health and make those strikes deal 300 instead? He still takes more or less the same strikes to kill. You've simply undermined what was originally a pretty reserved, steady progression system. It's thoughtless. The way skills are thrown on your lap makes each worth less than the base game, which is insane because one of the major flaws of the vanilla version was how limited your viable techniques are. The changes to Masters feed you with even more useless techniques, and the few attacks that were rebalanced, such as Flying Kick, are now overpowered in the early game. It feels like a randomizer with haphazard placement of practically every change, everything set in stone, but it doesn't feel like it. One of the AP draining abilities is a testament to bad decisions. In the Lighthouse, there's a foe who slowly saps the party's AP the longer you leave him alive. It's taken in small increments, so you have time to shift focus to him without an entire dungeon rerun. In this, his first sap takes the entirety of the party's AP in one go due to the formula being based off stat differences. As stats are 7-fold, this spell is unnecessarily punishing. The story stuff is as it was, but the Masters, skill acquisition, stats, and equipment have all changed. The effort that went into this is far more impressive than the end result, but it's just not good. The 1v1 between Ryu and Gar pissed me off as he had Shadow Walk and all sorts of bullshit that'd double or triple my HP. He took several attempts of banking on good RNG just to win. I'd finally end up quitting during the zombie dragon fight as he strung instant kill attacks and then in the final stretch pulled an attack that doubled my health value. I don't know how you're supposed to deal with that, so I didn't. Things are looking up for Path of a Goddess. All it has to do is not piss me off and it wins. It starts with low numbers, a seemingly vanilla experience. I actually had to check that I patched the ROM correctly, but certain monsters are renamed, have different health values, and come packing different techniques. The bird guy, who usually gives you the blind technique, also comes with Flying Kick, which was originally acquired much later. It's almost usable here as Ray starts with decent agility, so it is given space to be potentially viable, though the accuracy is still dogshit. The Curs have Bone Dart, which is a low damage technique that confuses foes on hit. It's dangerous to try and learn as confusion can easily eat your ass, but I must have it. This is what I mean by intentional thought out inclusions, taking abilities that by all rights should have been early game techs and shuffling them around. It is literally that easy. It's not about finding a place for everything, there's too much to be comfortably housed. It's about finding appropriate places for things formerly neglected and shunned. Bone Dart still sucks, but I actually want to use it because it comes so early. A few of the McNeil Ghost sub-bosses are actually set up pretty well. One saps your AP and has a high physical resist, which, you can kind of get around using items, while another casts Gloom on you, making you undead, then follows up with Holy Strike to deal bonus damage, which, if you're feeling lucky, is learnable. That's what I'm saying. Using often overlooked features of the game to craft a specific challenge is great. Magic has been made usable and often carries, which makes Nina the MVP in most fights, and her stat rates are insane. When I read the title Path of a Goddess, I thought it was referring to Miria, but it's actually Nina. It's not all sunshine, however. Enemies come in huge packs now, filling any available space on the screen, which does run in direct contrast to how you want to take your time and try to learn all of the new and displaced abilities. I get why it was done, and it makes Magic infinitely better, again, as crowd control's basically a necessity. There's some conflicting design. Toward the end of the game, particularly around fighting Elder, regular enemies will one-shot you with magic or critical hits that seem like they roll every single turn. There's gotta be like an 80% chance, and it leans hard back into the thoughtless zone. The seams start to come apart as you realize you're level 40, and the melee masters have been nerfed so hard that, melee's basically useless outside of the dragon forms. Even if you could deal damage, Magic is immune to the same crit reprisals, making it objectively better, which all kinda compounds with the D-Lord, who is now a physical damage rush. A minor criticism is that Nina has a high reprisal rate, which just adds unnecessary seconds to each battle, assuming she survives the inevitable crit. Also, I had some crashing issues against this enemy called Pride, who seems to be a Goo King rework. At first, I thought it was Ryu using his true Kaiser form, but taking any action with Ryu has a decent chance of crashing, and it deletes your save. Luckily, save states were unaffected. I am running it through RetroArch on my Switch, so who knows if it's common on real emulators, but if you're picking it up, be careful. Overall, I'd say the first 70% of the game is pretty solid, and the back 30% is iffy. Like, if you stopped at that point, you would have experienced the best of it, but if you banked that 70%, you're probably gonna finish it regardless. Path of a Goddess wins. I still prefer the base game though. Sorry. I didn't play this hack, but I'm gonna recommend it anyway. Breath of Fire 3, like most old games, is a bit quirky in its translation. Certain items promise functions they do not deliver, or are incredibly vague about. This mod simply makes the game a little more transparent by giving you specific statistics for items and equipment with extra effects. For example, Razor's 2-hit becomes accuracy plus 10%, and that makes a lot more sense to anyone who knows English. Yeah, it's not as romantic and fluffy, it's a little more cold, objective, particularly for a game that doesn't strictly require it, but if you've never played it and you want certain descriptions to be clearer, play this version, as to my knowledge it changes nothing else. Maeson. Maeson? My son. My son keeps a busy schedule, he's thriving, so we'd better try to keep up. Let's start with Digimon World. While the changes made here are a major behind-the-scenes shake-up, from a player's point of view, there's not a lot different. And I don't say that to be dismissive, the fact that you can't really tell what's different means that most of the jank progression gating from the original has been tuned to the point where it's no longer a major barrier to entry. Battles yield increased money, giving you far more access to items and an easier move into the mid-game, and I felt like I rolled better monsters for avoiding care mistakes, which also made it quite a bit easier to keep the progression piling up. The late game was also aided with a longer lifespan, and while I do love the original design of Digimon World, warts and all, it's nice seeing the age of your buddy creep into the double digits without panicking too hard. The amount of times I've had a supercharged beast die right in front of a powerful boss is maybe twice, but it sucked each time. In my son's mod, all of the monsters died because I'm bad at spamming healing items. I used 3 total monsters in this run, and none of them died to age. Just because I've played it a lot doesn't mean I'm good at it. By not noticing the differences could also be that I've played it so many times, anything short of a major shakeup is gonna feel like I'm simply playing optimally, and not that the game is carrying me. The rate at which rare food drops appear on the ground is significantly increased, and enemies seem to have a near 100% drop rate, and any item makes life easier. If you were less experienced with it, you'd benefit far more than someone who can whip through in a couple hours, such as myself. The small changes become more significant the higher your in-game timer is, and while I don't have a lot to say, it was less stressful and a far more pleasant time. I wouldn't recommend it for a first-time player, but if you've quit your first run through, I would recommend it for you, as you'd likely find the oppressive atmosphere is reduced. If for whatever reason you can't gel with the original as it was, this might be a nice rebound to rekindle your Digimon adventure. But if you know even a little bit about this game or are a veteran, unfortunately I think the changes are too minor to have a major impact. Still, comfy playthrough, thanks for making it. Hey, what do you get if you took the job system from Final Fantasy V and haphazardly crammed it into the previous iteration? Go on, guess. Oh no, there's no punchline. Some crazy bastard did it, and it's pretty good. The story plays the same, where characters come and go, but the party consists entirely of your endgame guys, and once they join initially, they never leave. You're immediately gifted Kain and Rydia, Rose is not far behind, and then, Edge finally waddles on scene in the mid-game, and there's your color-coded party. Everyone comes with their base job, but making them naked allows you to switch roles, with more coming in as a result of the story, as well as upgrades to existing classes. It's not super difficult, and I'm unsure if the difficulty was changed much, or if the job system simply allows you to mess around with suboptimal abilities, which makes it seem harder. As your new party will consist of a contrarian take, since that's kind of the point, it's about novelty. The tougher bosses can push you pretty hard. The first thing I did was turn Rydia into a Dragoon and Cecil a Monk, so I had no utility and minimal defenses and got blasted quite a few times. Stats are permanently determined by level ups, which is fine, nothing wrong with a bit of consequence for your actions. You do have to be careful over-committing though, as levels rush in way faster than the base game. I was nearing level 50 in my return trip to Hell, and despite that, switching classes is made quite easy. The inventory still functions like the original release, it's clunky, but you're given permanent menu access to the Fat Chocobo, and the characters animate as you hover over equipable items, so management and switching classes is a breeze. Having such a major roster shake-up, stores are shifted around, the classes themselves have been reworked, it's all pretty snazzy. If you've played Final Fantasy IV literally hundreds of times like myself, it is a safe, welcome shuffle that ultimately repurposes things already in the game to give you a greater freedom to make progress. And it does it all without brutalizing you, like plenty of hard mods are known to do. I enjoyed it greatly, it gave me an excuse to replay Final Fantasy IV again, though I will say the limited job ability gives it far less replayability than you'd expect, but that is a very minor complaint. I give it Final Fantasy IV out of 5. Before the game loads, we're greeted with a choice, Visuals A or Visuals B, and these seem to just affect character sprites and portraits. I wasn't particularly fond of either from the outset, but it was tough to find a thorough comparison without spoiling parts of the game. At a certain point, you've just got to own your visual decisions, so I did the same and stuck with the original variant. Is it anime beautiful? No. Will it affect how good the game is in a major way? I don't know, how vain are you? It's a genuine question, because the answer might be yes. Most characters are fine, but Edgar looks rough. He definitely looks like royalty, but also a school shooter at the same time. Realm looks like the Virgin meme. They couldn't quite decide if they wanted a grittier, ugly realism or to anime-ify everything. Outside of that, plenty of palettes have been switched to add more of a distinct regal vibe. There's more blues and purples than the base sprites, which gives characters a much harder contrast, and I dig that. I also appreciated the general spread of new and tuned up sprites to add some visual flair to the world. But that's all vanity. Let's talk about the meat. What's changed? Well, I'd say there are as many additions as there are reorganizations. Most of the vanilla concepts and features are there, but mixed up, intentionally shifted, and locked out. For starters, only characters with a natural innate magic prowess can equip espers and use spells. I dig this in theory, but it's a bit detrimental at the same time, locking the entire subsystem of espers and ability acquisition to 3 characters. The extra Esper stats and skills acquired from gear are obviously out, and characters have been tuned up a little to compensate. For example, Locke is now a combination of his former self and Shadow, being able to steal while also lobbing his ill-gotten gains. Honestly, fantastic change. Apparently Gao's been fixed up, but I never use Gao. I feel bad, people always seem to give Gao the biggest refinements in terms of character revamps, but I never use him in vanilla or any ROM hacks. I'm sorry, ROM hackers. Your effort's wasted on me. Sabine and Cyan no longer have their weird skill gimmicks and can use them directly from a menu selection. For Cyan, this is fantastic. For Sabin, I'm of 2 minds. I understand it, but I don't necessarily support it. There are a bunch of custom sprites from other games, as well as tunes. I was pleasantly met with the Lufia battle theme in one area, and the Undead Dragon from Breath of Fire 2, so points for that. A surprising number of enemies come packing heat. David Bowie is now armed to the teeth, but we're not so helpless ourselves. We've got our own concealed carry license. Dual-wielding Berettas kind of screws with Locke's utility as a treasure hunter, or Setz's ability as a complete shit show of a character, but it's still pretty cool. They also added bows for the Mage Knights in Celes and Terra, and honestly it had never occurred to me that Final Fantasy VI didn't have bows until I saw the sprites and was like, what the fuck are you doing here? It does seem a little wasted, as the only 2 characters who can use bows are 2 of the 3 magic users, and if you've got them, it's for the magic. But, I'm not going to complain about build options, it just seems a little crammed, if you get what I'm saying. The difficulty though, it's tight. It's slightly tougher than a more naturally balanced Final Fantasy VI would have been, so, while it's still pretty easy, you can be taken by surprise. And I hate being one-shot in ROM hacks. The amount of times I was suspiciously one-shot, particularly with Locke, was a pattern, and we like to notice those. That said, once you start basking in the endgame content, the difficulty ramps hard, requiring strict approaches to tougher fights. Life 3 or Auto Life is a crutch and is required many times. I don't like that. If you've got to rely on Auto Life to clear a fight, it's kinda cheap. Like, why are monsters hitting harder than my potential health value? Functionally, applying an automatic revival is a check. When Dingus uses his ace technique, it checks against your status for good housekeeping, but that's what HP already does, which kinda relegates Auto Life to a flashy showing of what's already in the works, at least in my opinion. Let's get back on topic. I just hate how long it takes to set up and revive dudes constantly. I think that's a major flaw in a lot of difficult fights, especially in ROM hacks. Anyway, the bestiary was also neat, as I didn't feel the need to stick around in marginally tougher encounters to figure out what their rare steal was. If you fight an enemy once, their entire statistical breakdown gets added to an in-game bestiary, which is really slick. I didn't do much targeted stealing, but when I wanted to, it made life a lot easier. What I did stick around for was the random boss encounters, some of which disallow flight. I loved moving through an area, getting forced into a battle, and hearing that boss music, my cortisol would spike like someone tried to feed me cheese. It gave an ominous weight to the fairly standard random encounters. Bosses could be here, I thought. I hate bosses. When you're in a particularly long thoroughfare or revisiting areas, the enemies you're unable to flee from become a chore, but they are few and far between. Another boon of the random bosses is that they're a decent chunk of the endgame. There are rarer encounters strewn throughout Kefka's tower, and they not only drop the best equipment in the game, but come in 2 waves of 4, and then like a super duper extra guy, and beating these as well as power leveling also introduces extra forms to the Kefka fight. I'd say all the new sprites are very well implemented, and most look like they belong. The sheer number is insane too. I dare say the few remaining native Final Fantasy VI sprites are far outnumbered by the new and borrowed, which is an insane effort. The ROM notes state that the mod is based off a few other hacks, so I'm not lumping this criticism solely on this specific hack, but swapping Shadow for Leo narratively makes no sense, and then kinda snowballs into a bunch of strange events that come out of nowhere. I complained a little bit, sure, but I also enjoyed Soldier's Contingency enough to put it in the video, and a lot of what I complained about was down to personal taste, which, look, I'm sure this specific hack has copped a ton of. I'd still say T Edition's better, but if you've already played that, give this one a try as well. You might be thinking, that's too many Final Fantasy games for one video, and that's so right. You're always right. Good job, champ. Anyway, my son, you know the guy, we talked about him 10 minutes ago, well, he had a whack at Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, and it's pretty tight. The patch notes confess a yearning for the skills that go underused in favour of one-shotting everything with melee attacks, and while a swift sword to the dome is a smashing good time, it's fair to want to make it a little bit more mentally engaging. The question in my mind is, how do you even approach that when most skills are useless, cost too much, or come too late? Not to mention that you've got 2 forms of utility, direct and ailments. If you're not doing numbers, you're either supplementing numbers or temporarily nerfing the foes. What your boy settled on was gimping melee so hard that you have no other choice, but all the classes got to shuffle around too, with tiers of spell disappearing, and in their place, freedom. And a lot of status effects. I'd open by lulling my foes with a weirdly accurate sleep until I acquired break, and then I petrified everyone until I got death, because nothing deals damage and enemies are far more likely to heal and revive one another, which can make battles feel incredibly sluggish when you're not spamming spells. Skills are no longer acquired through gear and are manually bought with JP, which is now a currency. Weapons can temporarily allow you to use certain techniques, but unless you buy it yourself, that attack goes with your equipment. I should also mention that shields and armor no longer come with learnable abilities. You can just buy counter from the outset. The removal of learned abilities does turn equipment from a necessary evil more into an optimized stat game, as they tend to follow some kind of split and weighted formula. It invalidates about half of the equipment table. Even with that staggered gear release we love from Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced, you're not checking gear anywhere near as often, and its viability is severely lacking. Judge points pay out like experience and are no longer used in combo attacks or for Totema summons. I don't even know if they're still in the game, and that's fair because they're kinda OP in the base game anyway. Once you learn something, it's yours forever, and you're given both slots to mix and match classes as you please without losing access to the item command. That's a permanent fixture. Functionally, Maeson's modifications shift from one-shotting with melee to one-shotting with status ailments. While it subs one over-reliant evil for another, the intended effect was realised, and if you've ever wanted to have a squeeze at some underloved abilities from a pretty comfy game, it's a solid way to experience that. One criticism I do have is how the MP distribution works, where you start combat with a full pool, but skills still cost quite a bit, and once you're dry, you've got to rely on severely underpowered melee, or wait for your reserves to recover 5 MP per turn. You could say that it encourages you to manage your resources better, and I would certainly agree, but it also forces you to overly rely on those resources to the point of almost having the opposite effect at the end of most encounters. As your foes are more modular as well, unsuspecting classes can lean into healing and reviving one another, and if you're biding your time waiting for your MP to come back while the foe's hobbling around reviving their team, battles do drag. I think I already said that. I don't want to beat my son too hard. This is a genuinely impressive effort, but a bit more time in the oven might have alleviated some of the tedious wait times. It's good, give it a try. And here we have another comparison, Pokemon trading card game Generations versus Neo. Both titles follow the standard sequence of events, not that you need a lot of narrative justification to play cards, and they have their own sets and card art. Neo seems to lift a majority of it from the real-life Johto set, and I don't know what Generations is based off, but I personally think the card art is way better. That's not to say Neo's bad, but it's working off a base, right? And the base isn't amazing. Generations also has a much steadier difficulty curve, where Neo chucks you in the deep end and destroys you. The issue with card games that have finite and all obtainable sets is that the difficulty can only go so far, as you and your opponent have access to the exact same tools. And with more card acquisition or more playing, that gap shrinkens. But that doesn't stop the early game in Neo absolutely putting you in your place. Where in Generations you can waltz into a gym and take on the leader immediately, if you try to pull that same shit in Neo, you are playing against such odds, you'd be better off praying that a plane crashes through the gym than drawing your next card. It sticks to the original game a bit closer in that regard, whereas Generations seems to cull the number bloat and gives cards far more utility than turning every encounter into a pointless sweep and simply changing the direction with the wind. This even comes down to energy cost, where Generations is far more modest. It would be easy to chastise either title for not allowing much in the way of creative freedom when it comes to deck construction, but with around 300 cards per title, due to the Game Boy's limitation, it has to remain fairly surface level, lest you lead people too hard into niche builds with bizarre setups. And you know, maybe I'm old school, but I don't think something like that works for a game like Pokemon TCG, at least not in this capacity. You can't really gather your magic or Gyo your Yugi in 8 bits. I will say though, I did hit the same AI walls in both titles, where Generations saw a Mimikyu with a Pokemon power that prevents evolved mons dealing damage to it and then gives him a snipe move dealing 20 damage to a bench Pokemon. Every time I use this guy, I just win, and the AI would do literally nothing. Neo had a similar mechanic in Pichu, who had lower health at a whopping 30, and his only attack saw a bad coin flip deal 10 damage to himself. Also, the AI actually swapped into a non-evolved mon to cap the little bastard after about 10 turns. These are minor issues and probably just a holdover of whatever AI the Game Boy let you get away with. I would hesitate bigly before I said this was anyone's fault but Nintendo. And you know, I think blaming Nintendo for anything in current year is kind of smiled upon by everybody. Honestly, I could take either of these games and be perfectly content. I did marginally prefer Generations, as it gave you more of a chance to get back in the fight, where, you know, in Neo, if your opponent sets up a sweep, it's kind of just over. Though once you are past the early game, it doesn't happen nearly as often, so 2 solid ROM hacks. If you choose either of these, you'll not choose wrong. I'm not usually fond of games that have no narrative justification or tangible explorative progress, you know, games that take the battle mechanics and lean way too hard on them, but I enjoyed the combat in Mario RPG so much, this was a rare exception. There is a narrative technically, there's a cutscene at the start where some little dudes put you to sleep and diddle ya. The rest of the game is a combat gauntlet. It's a roguelite, you start with one guy, recruit more guys, get through battles as best you can. There's really not a lot to say. The party's no longer Mario locked and you're free to select whomsoever in whatsoever order. Due to this, the difficulty can be heavily modified. For example, if you rock in with Mallow or Peach to open, you're gonna have a slightly harder time than starting with King Koopa himself. Equipment and items are curtailed and controlled, giving you pretty limited access, but the difficulty curve is designed around what you're given. Everything's had a nice set of tweaks to it. That doesn't stop a well-primed Bowser being a one-shot machine, but again, your selections determine the difficulty. I know it's hard, but you don't have to use Bowser. Stages take place in several of the game's maps, having sub-maps that feature strings of encounters with a boss at the end. Sometimes the boss has a star, you get all the stars, beat the Nightmare Sages, and win the game. There's also a boss rush and a 100 floor challenge, but I don't love the combat that much. If you enjoy Mario RPG and want a fresh take on a classic, I would highly recommend it. For people such as myself who need a fuller ROM hack experience, it is still worth a try, but you'll likely find the enjoyability factor waning about halfway through. And that's it! We played a lot of great games tonight. I'd like to thank ROMs as well as hacking. Without their enormous efforts, we wouldn't be here, and of course, check the description. The next ROM hacking video is just gonna be Goof Troop. Look forward to that in 2 years. Bye!